everyone. My name is Zach. Today I'm here with Professor Santiago Zabala. We're going to be speaking about his course as part of the SMR ICP program, the Integrated Credit Program. Just to give a quick word about what SMR is first, and then we will move on from there. The School of Materialist Research, which is SMR, is an education and research inter-university grassroots platform that offers integrated credit programs, seminars, special programs, and research initiatives that address the materialisms running through contemporary science, philosophy, art, mathematics, design, architecture, and politics. SMR was founded by the Center for Philosophical Technologies at Arizona State University, the Institute of Social Sciences and Humanities Skopje, the Department for Architecture, Theory, and Philosophy of Technics at TU Wien, and the Critical Inquiry Lab, the Design Academy Eindhoven, and serves as a global hub for education, research, and experimentation of the intersection of the humanities, social sciences, creative fields, and the STEM sciences. As I said, today we'll be talking with Professor Santiago Zabala, who's a distinguished author and professor about his upcoming course as part of the ICP program this fall. His course is entitled Philosophical Warnings. Just to introduce him to anyone who is unaware, Zabala is the ICREA Research Professor of Philosophy at the Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona. He is author of many books, including Why Only Art Can Save Us, Aesthetics in the Absence of Emergency, Being at Large, Freedom in the Age of Alternative Facts, and more recently, Science from the Future, A Philosophy of Warnings. His opinion articles have appeared in the New York Times, Al Jazeera, and the Los Angeles Review of Books, among other international media outlets. So now to sort of begin talking about the course briefly. I guess we should begin. We're obviously in a sort of interesting time in the world, both politically, ecologically, aesthetically, sort of faced with all sorts of different crises, which are occurring, sort of all over the world. Here in Canada, where I am, I'm sure, also in Catalonia, where you are. So I guess we could just sort of start by asking, well, what is to be done is the old Lenin question, but what is this course sort of addressing about this sort of future? What sort of warnings are we looking at? And just sort of, yeah, the general trajectory and structure of your course, I suppose.
Okay, well, thank you very much, first of all,
Yeah.
for inviting me. I'm honored to give these lectures, and I see the other people you invited are also much more important than I am, so I'm very happy to be part of this session. So, philosophical warning. Basically, this I'm going to give a course on some aspects of the book you mentioned, which is coming out in October. Actually, doing the course, I think on the 28th it's coming out. So right during the course it will come out. And the basic idea of the book and the course is to suggest or propose that philosophy is not a method, it's not a system, it's a warning. Philosophers, the only thing we really do, or even, or actually have done until now, is we can provide warnings. We can't do much more than that. And why warning? So where did this concept come from? And what is the fundamental question that I'm going to try to develop? Because in philosophy we don't answer questions, we try to find the good questions. And the basic question I think of the 21st century, or the question we should all be addressing, and I think also the question that many philosophies are addressing without knowing it, is the following. In other words, why don't we listen to warnings? We are warned constantly, right? Not only by philosophers about the death of God or many other issues, but also we are warned every day in society. We're warned constantly about future pandemics, terrorist attack, nuclear threat, etc., etc. In other words, the idea of warnings actually comes from my previous research, the other two books you mentioned. And the other two books had this idea, this basic thesis that I've been developing for a while now, which is it's taken in part from Heidegger, but also from other authors. And the idea is that you mentioned emergencies, that we have a lot of emergencies now going on, the genocide now on the Palestinian people, and many others, which we could mention. And the idea, I think, of what characterized this 21st century, at least since September 11th, since the terrorist attack in New York, is that there is the greatest emergencies we have. Now, I said the greatest emergency. I didn't say the only emergency, but the greatest emergency we have is the absence of emergency. In other words, for example, the example I just made of Palestine. Well, unfortunately, that is a greatest emergency. In other words, it's an absence emergency. I'm not saying that people are not, it is not an actual emergency that we actually see, but it is absent. In other words, we are not allowed, okay, most of us in the West who think a genocide is going on, to confront that issue. In other words, it's even impossible, almost impossible to help them in some way. Something similar is taking place with, for example, the climate change, our climate emergency. We've been warned, we've been for a very long time, right? And it's still going on now, and nothing has really changed. And we've seen this also after the pandemic, right? So the problem, the greatest emergencies is the absence of emergency. Now, how can we translate that in a way, or how can we structure that in a philosophy or in a more philosophical way? Well, we can talk about philosophy as warning. In other words, warnings are really absent emergencies. I mean, I'm warning you to Santiago, you should stop drinking or start drinking less. Well, that's a warning. It's a warning meant to do what? Well, it's different from predictions, right? If a doctor would tell me, Santiago, you have to stop. You can also continue to drink because you're going to die next week, right? Your liver has failed. That is a prediction. It's not a warning. A warning is different, right? A warning implies the possibility of a radical break with the present, right? So if you don't stop drinking now, right? If you stop drinking now, you will be better. So the idea of a warning is actually a very radical concept because it not only gives us the possibility of a radical break with the present, but also of, and this is what I'm going to be talking a lot in the course, of a different future. And by future, I don't mean what we normally think about the future in terms of futurology or and all that, but our prediction, but rather in terms of what there isn't a word in English for this, but in French is l'avenir. In other words, what is to come, which is a concept that Derrida, of course, have developed a lot. So, and this deals with hermeneutics, with our involvement, with our necessity that we basically are in beings that interpret. So, in order to have a different future in the terms of avenir, we have to be able to listen to warning, which is something we do not do. We have all the data in the world, right? We even have too much data, but it's absolutely useless because the only warnings that work are not the ones that are verifiable through objective data, et cetera, or whistleblowers that give us the object data or information, but rather through pressure. That's why I think that when Nietzsche warns us that God has died, or that God is dead, or Simone de Beauvoir warns us that one becomes a woman, or Heidegger warns us that science does not think, or Anna Arendt warns us of the banality of evil. Those are warnings meant to do what? Well, to change our conceptual beliefs, to change in some way now what we are supposed, where we're going to. So that is more or less the general idea behind what I'm going to be lecturing on.
Perfect. Thanks so much for that answer. Yeah, sounds fascinating. What do you think? We said the biggest sort of emergency is the absence of emergency or something like this. What do you think the sort of biggest sort of prophetic thing right now, or what is the sort of most pressing warning, I suppose I should word it as?
Great, great. Thank you for asking that. That's a very good question. I'm not going to lie, it comes up often, but it's
Yeah.
a very good question that a lot of people point out because it could seem like a flaw, right? So which warning are you going to listen to? There's so many coming from scientists, philosophers, or whatever. Well, I think what I have come up with is this idea that, well, the only, let's say, measure we have for deciding, well, which warning am I going to listen to? I think the greatest sign we have is that we should be listening to the warnings that are most absent. So a warning, when we have 62,000 people slaughtered in the past year by Israel, I think it qualifies, right?
Mhm.
And when we have 7 people dying per year of lung cancer due to the quality of the air in Barcelona and every metropolis in Europe, it qualifies, right? And I could go on, and I would find myself in the same situation, right? We would have probably maybe 10 of them up there that are really,
Yep.
really, I mean, they're really absent. I mean, is it possible that we can't even see them? We can't even. Well, that would already give us some sort of indication as to where we should go, right? Which one we should be listening to more. That's the criteria more or less that I have chosen. But I think this is also something that it depends a lot on each one of us. It's not that we can save the world, all of us, right? So each of us has a different criteria. But the idea is the more absent the emergency is, in other words, the less we listen to that warning, right, the more action it requires.
Yep. Thank you.
Right?
And you also said, yeah, that we might, I don't know, have too much information or too much data about what's happening. Do you think being sort of inundated and flooded with different information from different sources and whatnot is sort of potentially sort of muddying the waters and making maybe the things that are absent even more absent um, from knowing too much, or is it something else entirely?
Okay, let me respond to that question with, so which are the philosophies that are not helping us to
Yeah,
listen to the world? Or in other words, because I mentioned 9/11, this 21st
yeah.
century, we many big crises, 9/11, financial crisis, the pandemic, uh, and even now the war in Ukraine and also in Palestine. So and this idea that, well, all these events show that nothing has really changed. On the contrary, there has been an intensification of what was already going on before. Now, which are the philosophies that, and which also not only philosophies, also psychologists and etc. There are many, many different intellectuals working in favor of this idea of absence of emergency. In other words, to conserve, right? They're conservatives to conserve things as they are.
Mhm.
Well, the first philosophies that I can think who are responsible for this are all the neo-realist philosophers. So Graham Harman, Gabriel Marcus, uh, Quentin Lassus. So all this idea of returning to object, to returning to facts, which is something that has become popular. I'm not so sure why it has become popular, and nothing really new happens in philosophy. So, but anyway, it became popular, and well, I think from a theoretical point of view, just like Zizek and Simon Critchley and Judith Butler have pointed out, it is very poor. I mean, nobody wants to, the idea of returning to pre-Kantian philosophy, it's a little bit dubious. Also from a political point of view, I mean, my friend Gabriel Marcus has this book out on, he came up with this idea of an ethics for everybody, for the whole world. So the idea of coming up with an ethics for the whole world, that means that you did not read Fanon, you have no idea about critical theory. So it is skewed, but it is also actually a symptom. It's a symptom of this return to order, which works very well with all the far right populists that we have, because
Mhm.
basically Bolsonaro, Meloni, Trump, etc. They all want what? They want more order, right? And they want and actually, if you think about it clearly, you will see that they are the ones who deny the greatest emergencies we have, right? None of them believe in climate change, right? None of them believe in so many, not even during the pandemic, in the United States, they did not declare a state of exception, for example. So philosophically, we have also Peter Jordanson, Peter Jordan Peterson.
Yeah, there you
Uh, Right. Another one. I mean, he's a very clear example of that. I mean, he thinks one can only talk about sex with discussing biological animals. So that is all part of this return to order, which I think is the first, from a cultural point of view, the first responsible, or let's say the first one, the first they are the one who are sustaining in some way this return to order and this absence of emergencies that continues to propagate, while philosophy is supposed to be something much more critical, which I don't think I need to explain who they are in this school, not with you, right?
yeah, exactly. So are these warning themselves then? if we're trying to move away from order, are they sort of necessarily, we said a sort of radical break from what is? But also, in order to find this sort of radical break, you're also going back, of course, to Heidegger, to Beauvoir, to Nietzsche, and so on and so forth.
Mhm.
Um, so it's I don't know how to word this, but are they enacting some sort of like previous revolution that we're not revolution, but I don't know, sort of a warning that's also a revolt that we're now sort of meant to be interpreting and carrying out, or um, is it sort of why go back to them for this thing that's meant to be a radical break with what's happening, I suppose.
So on the one hand, I think that we have now a lot of philosophies, like for example, animal philosophy or plant philosophy,
Yeah.
or there's even insects now philosophy. They all deal with environmental issues, but they are a clear sign that they are actually warning philosophies. They might not know they are,
Mhm.
but they are in some way. All this plant philosophy, which I think is very interesting, it's also a way of telling us to be careful, right? They're warning us of the consequences of destroying plants or vegetative life, etc. So on the environmental side, that's very easy, but there are many other. But the reason for going back, and in my book, I try to go back in the introduction, I go all the way back to Socrates, who is someone who warned us a lot about many things. I focus on these four authors, which I will focus in the course, mostly because of the consequences they had now. So, for example, to use the Heidegger idea of that science doesn't think, that we live in a pure technological world, and he warned us, made a lot of mistakes, Heidegger, not to mention the political ones, but that that point on technology he didn't get wrong. In other words, we are not thinking, and artificial intelligence is, of course, the culmination of that. It is the situation in which we would all end up writing the same way. In other words, saying meaningless things. So, if Heidegger wanted to warn us through that idea that science doesn't think, well, we have certainly not listened at all, right? And we find ourselves now not even being able or capable of doing any sort of setting any minimum rules for artificial intelligence. So I use this because I think that it's very easy afterwards to see how that warning has not been listened to. The same thing can be said about Anna Arendt, that she explains that the banality of evil, and she even goes as far as to point out something that I think is very important, because Anna Arendt insists in saying that thinking means to be able to think the invisible. In other words, what we don't see. Well, a warning is very much like that. A warning is not something that they tell you precisely what it will be. It's a warning. It's an invitation to pressure you in order to create a change. So I think those four authors are interesting authors that can be that I will go in detail in each lecture. But we could use so many others. I don't Adorno, someone else who warned us a lot, and I could go back.
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah, okay. I suppose you're also sort of combating this sort of end of history narrative at the same time, if we're sort of working past it. There's lots of this discourse still going on about how the world is actually getting better, even sort of people have longer lives, well, at least in the West anyway, and yada yada yada. Um, do you think that's a large issue that's also sort of pressing against this, or is this still, I don't know, it seems like it's sort of general offshoot of a form of capitalist thought to act this way?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't get the question. I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry, I was just wondering, this is also going against any sort of like end of history. The warning isn't to sort of reach the end of history, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Now I understand. Okay,
yeah,
so what is the end of history in a warning? Well, unfortunately, there is no end, because
yeah,
what is to reframe your question, because in order for me to respond. So what does a warning have? It's Can a warning be definite in some way?
yeah,
Can a warning can it actually be a statement that it cannot? A warning is not meant to, like I said before, truth is not necessary to warn us, right? When your doctor tells you, Santiago, you have to stop drinking or reduce your drinking, I obviously will not listen to him. But if I see that someone very close to me gets sick because of the same reason, that's when we often change, right? That's when we often do respond to the warning. So the question here is that warnings, in order to work, well, there is no end of history. There is a continuation, right? A warning requires our intervention. In other words, our interpretation or intervention, but it requires an intervention that is meant to continue in some way that warning. In other words, I have to make that warning that the physician or whoever is giving me, I have to make it mine. It has to become mine. The question here is also an Nietzsche explained, because all the idea of Nietzsche's of the Übermensch, uh, the overman in English, it's meant to create someone who is able to listen to the warning, right? Who has the who does not believe in the end of history, who does not believe in foundationalism, right? Who does not believe in metaphysics, who instead must have the swiftness, must have the ability, right, to decide which warning to choose in some way. So we are actually called to become active interpreters of warnings, right? We're not called to just to listen to accept the warning. We're called to listen to the warning. So my whole lectures will deal with this idea that, well, I think that the basic question today is, why don't we listen to warning? And there are many responses we can give to that question. And I think it's important to look at the warnings we had until now to find out, well, actually, even Fukuyama's idea of the end of history can quite easily be interpreted as a warning. He it is I don't think he was. I mean, it very easily can be considered something that it's a problem in some way, right? It is not just something that has occurred. So all this has to do with the relationship I mentioned before between l'avenir and the future, but also with the past. So the idea of warnings is not to believe in the past as history, but rather to believe in the past as a past. So in other words, not as something that has occurred and we know how to describe it, but rather in the path that we decide we have to make. Right? So this philosophy is really in relation to history. It is a philosophy of history, but it is also a philosophy. Philosophy of history can only be a true philosophy if it also considers warning, where warnings are and where they go. Right. So this is the basic idea of the lectures I would be lecturing. It would all be on Heidegger, Nietzsche, Simone de Beauvoir, and Arendt.
Perfect. Thanks so much for answering the questions. If there's anything else that you want to add about the course, otherwise, I thank you for your time and um,
No, I'm very happy to do
yeah,
the lectures, and thank you very much for inviting me.
yeah. Thank you so much again for being here. That was Professor Santiago Zabala. His course is upcoming in this fall.